Well, good evening, everyone. My name's Nathan Richards. I'm the program head in the Maritime Heritage program at the Coastal Studies Institute. I'd like to welcome you to the seventh in our presentation series, Our Underwater Heritage presentation series. Tonight we'll be listening to Joe Hoyt give a presentation. Before we start, I'd like to thank our sponsors. First of all, the Outer Banks Community Foundation, who provided financial support for the series to start. This series has been running since January and will continue until December. I'd like to thank the Hatteras, the Graveyard Atlantic Museum in Hatteras. All of these talks are given twice, once in Hatteras and once here at CSI, and also the Coastal Studies Institute. As we go through, if you could please silence your cell phones. The other thing, just to say, Joe Hoyt is a graduate of ECU's Maritime Studies program. He graduated in 2008. He's not from around here, he's from Ohio and did his thesis research up in the Great Lakes, but now he's maritime archaeologist with Monitor National Marine Sanctuary. And tonight he's going to talk about some work on the Ashkhabad from 2013. So we'll keep our questions till the end, and otherwise I'll turn it over to Joe.
Cool. Thank you. All right. So as Nathan said, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the Ashkhabad, which is a shipwreck that's down off of the Cape Lookout area, so just a little bit south of where you are. But before I do that, I'll talk a little bit about kind of who I am and where I come from. Are you guys all, I'm assuming, from the local area? So some of this history should be pretty familiar to you. But are you guys aware of the National Marine Sanctuary Program? Have you heard, familiar with this? So the Sanctuary Program is a federal program under the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration that has a system of 15 sites around the country and in U.S. territorial waters. These sites are sort of similar in ethos to national parks. So they're set up to protect special places in the oceans, whether they're ecological, historic, or biological. So predominantly, these sites are natural-based sites. So we've got things like the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. Everyone's probably aware of the Florida Keys. There's the Hawaiian Island humpback whales. There's a site up in Stellwagen Bank off of Massachusetts that protects humpback whales as well. There's a number of sites off the coast of California. Out in the Pacific, there's the Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument, which protects the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. So a lot of these sites focus on natural features that are important ecologically. However, there are two sites that focus exclusively on maritime heritage and underwater archaeology. Those are the Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary, was located up in Lake Huron. That protects an area that holds as many as 300 wrecks dating back to the early 1800s and earlier than that even as well, that kind of tell the story of the building of the Middle American economy and Great Lakes shipping and these things. So it's just a really amazing collection of shipwrecks there that have a good cross-section of a couple hundred years of maritime history, and the cold, fresh water has amazing preservation. So you have these shipwrecks that are from the mid-1800s that still have masts still standing, the holds are still full of their cargo in some cases. It's a pretty spectacular place. So that site focuses on maritime heritage resources, and the other one is the site that I work for, the USS Monitor National Marine Sanctuary, which is right off the coast here. You guys have probably heard of the story of the Monitor and the Merrimack, Civil War ironclads that clashed just up the road here in Hampton Roads in March of 1862, and it was wrecked off here in December of 1862 in about 260 feet of water. The cool thing about the Monitor is that it is also the first National Marine Sanctuary that was ever designated. So our program came online in the 1970s, and Monitor was right around the time the Monitor was discovered, and so there was a scramble to figure out how do we protect this iconic American shipwreck, and we had this new law in the books called the National Marine Sanctuaries, so we became the first National Marine Sanctuary, and since then we've grown into a much larger system. Now, as I said, the program itself is predominantly focused on natural resources, even though the first site was us. Since that time, it's mostly gone towards ecological resources. However, sites like the Marine National Monument in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, the Florida Keys, the coast of California, these sites all, for the most part, also have shipwrecks within their boundaries. So although the expertise that exists at those areas is predominantly on the biological side, they're still in charge of resources that fall within their area. So towards that end, we have a national level program housed under the National Marine Sanctuaries called the Maritime Heritage Program, which is really cool because it makes sure that those resources that are in those sanctuaries, that's not their primary focus. We get to go around and do these inventories and study these wrecks and tell these stories so that we understand what's there and what's significant. As a part of that, starting in about 2008, we began at the Monitor site in partnership with Coastal Studies Institute and East Carolina University, looking at additional resources off the coast of North Carolina. We'd been in the early 2000s, we recovered big portions of the Monitor wreck site, including the rotating gun turret and the Erickson steam engine, some of these large features that have gone up to the Mariners Museum and are still undergoing conservation, will be for the next 20 years or so. And we said, okay, well, we've got all this expertise in managing and working on shipwrecks. What else is out there? And partnering with ECU, we started to get some interest in the World War II wrecks that are out here, particularly starting off with the U-boats. There was some concern over one of the U-boats that was recently kind of uncovered in about 2004, and some artifacts started going missing as divers had removed some material from the site. So we were approached to do an inventory of the sites to figure out what's there. There had never been really a baseline understanding of what the sites contained. So we started off this survey looking at the 3 known U-boat sites in North Carolina. And from there we said, man, there's really an incredible collection of resources off the coast. And we started a much larger project. So for those of you that don't know, you probably, I give talks on Battle of the Atlantic quite a lot around the country. And with the exception of people that live in this local area, the idea that U-boats were off the coast of North Carolina in 1942 is pretty surprising. Are you guys aware of this history? I'm sure that's kind of part of the local story. But the North Carolina in World War II was unique among the coastline. We had just, I guess, sort of to back up. The interesting thing to us about this as a program is that when you think of World War II, generally, when most people think of World War II, they think of it more so as a foreign war, something that happened far away, something that happened in Guadalcanal and Normandy and in Europe and North Africa and all these places. And of course, the United States had an integral role in this. It's a big story for the American people, but it's something that generally in the minds of people happened elsewhere. And with the exception of Pearl Harbor, some small instances in the coastal Oregon, the Aleutian Islands, a couple little isolated things up there. But generally, and at the time Pearl Harbor was not a state, of course it's now, but and in keeping with that idea, at the time, the United States wasn't particularly interested in being involved in World War II. So for a number of these reasons, we don't have people that realize that we have World War II sites in the United States. And once Pearl Harbor happened on December 7th of 41, Hitler declared war on just a few days later on December 11th, and by January 18th, so just barely over a month, the first ships were being sunk off North Carolina, which is just incredible to think. So they were basically ready to go out of the gate. They declared war. They're here. We were kind of not ready for it. And as a result, for the first 6 months of 1942, you have an enormous amount of ships being sunk all up and down the eastern seaboard in the Gulf of Mexico, really from Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, all the way down to Brazil. So this is a huge problem. They're really after one thing primarily. Anyone want to venture a guess why they're sinking merchant ships off the coast of the U.S.? What's the point? What's Germany trying to achieve in this effort? Stop the trade, really, exactly. So it's really a classic tactic of war is to cut off supply lines. And in this case, the major supply line was oil, right? So all the oil, all the fuel that was going into the RAF planes that were doing bombing raids into Germany and France, all that oil is coming out of the Gulf of Mexico. It's coming up the East Coast, and it's cutting across to Britain. So they can come over here and cut off that supply line. Britain's an island nation, right? So if you can squelch their resources, you can really limit their ability to wage war. And Germany knew this, and they also knew that there was no way that they were going to compete with Britain on the seas, on the surface of the seas, right? So the UK had a much, much more powerful surface fleet. So the Germans were forced in some regards to put their resources into the more clandestine warfare of submarines. This allowed them to be very effective without having to really engage in any large-scale surface battle. But they could tie up resources, they could sink resources, and this was the hope. And there was no place better to do it on the East Coast than in North Carolina. So as I said, this happened all the way up and down the eastern seaboard, but so why is North Carolina special? Why do we care so much about North Carolina when this was happening up off of New Jersey, up off of Newfoundland, down off the coast of Florida? What's unique about North Carolina? You guys are from here. This is a clue. You've got some crazy currents happening out here, right? So you got two major oceanic currents that are coming to a head, smacking into each other right off of Cape Hatteras. And the main thing really is, as I said, that you've got fuel or oil, bunker C, coming out of the Gulf, and it's coming up the East Coast. And right about here off Cape Hatteras, it's hanging a right and it's coming across to Europe, right? The reason it follows that route is because of the Gulf Stream. Yeah? The Gulf Stream, you think of it, I always think of it like a moving walkway in an airport, you know? Your ship's under power, but it's sure nice to have a little couple extra knots of speed. So you get in the Gulf Stream and you ride that river in the ocean all the way to Europe. Now, the significance of this is that when you get to this point off of Cape Hatteras, you know, you're kind of hugging the coastline, you're coming up, following the Gulf Stream, and everything is nice and tight. You're in a shipping lane, right? And the moment that you kind of peel off here, everything becomes a little bit more sparse. So this really acts as a bottleneck, this area here. You've got to come around the capes, whether you're going north or south, you've got to come around that point, and it creates sort of this natural feature. Then you've got a couple of other interesting things that are happening here. The way that the U-boats like to operate, they were really, really good offensive weapon, right? So they were sneaky, they would hide, you couldn't see them, they could fire a torpedo, they had the ability to sink ships that were much larger than themselves. But if they were spotted, they were a really terrible defensive weapon. They had to actually maneuver the entire vessel to be able to bring their torpedoes to bear, which was their main battery. And then they had some deck guns and some anti-aircraft things. But generally, their real approach was stealth and offensive attack. And their real defensive measure was to be able to hide, right? So to be able to hide, they wanted deeper water. So what you see here is the way that the continental shelf is off the eastern seaboard is from Florida up to about Cape Hatteras. The continental shelf is really close to shore. So you have these shipping lanes that are in shallow water, but you're really close to deep water. So you could come in, you could hunt in that shipping lane, and then you can go and hide in deeper water. But you get up north of that, and the continental shelf goes much further offshore, so you're a little bit more exposed. In addition to that, you've got things like water temperature that make a little bit of a difference for stealth, most notably at night. When the water is warmer further south, if you're operating at night, you're much more likely to be spotted from the air because you're churning up bioluminescent algae and these things. So there's all these kind of quirks of nature that have come together to make, as you guys know, the Outer Banks of North Carolina are a very unique landscape any way you cut it. But because of all these natural features sort of coming together, it created sort of a hot spot of U-boat activity. It was known to the German U-boat commanders that this was a place that they could come and sort of make a name for themselves. So they had a series of incentivized programs to encourage sinking larger vessels. They would have their promotions and their ranks were based on tonnage of vessels that they sunk. So the more tonnage that you could sink, the more accolades that you would receive. So this was known as a place you could come, sink some boats, go back to Berlin as a war hero, and this was done time and again. So I think that's really interesting. So it's kind of a little bit of background on why North Carolina is important in this story and why it stands out as unique. And why as we started looking more and more into this, we decided, man, this is really a special place. We need to have a better understanding of what is out here. So starting in 2008, we did the survey of these U-boats, and then we said we need to really kind of get a better handle on all these resources. So it's the U-boats, it's the U.S. vessels, British vessels that were escort ships, and of course the biggest piece of the puzzle is the merchant vessels. So just in that first 6 months of 1942, there were about 90 ships that were sunk just off North Carolina, which is insane. That's just a 6-month window, 90 vessels. And now that's, depending on where you draw the line, you could say a ship that's 200 miles offshore, it's still off North Carolina, that's pretty far away. So if you say just on the continental shelf, which is about 30 miles or so from shore, there's about 50 wrecks just from that first. There's one wreck that was sunk in 1943. The rest of them were all sunk in that first 6-7 months of 42. So we had a lot of work to do to start to understand what's out there. And so we started sort of going one at a time, looking at each one of these wrecks individually, but trying to understand how they fit together in this larger battlefield, in this larger landscape that we can understand each wreck on its own, but how it is connected to everything else into this broader story. So one of the sites that we had done a survey of in 2013 was a Russian tanker called the Ashkhabad. And this is a cool story. It's very, very typical of the stories that you would see during this time period. This was a tanker that was built in 1917 in Scotland. It was a tanker. It was meant to carry fuel or oil rather. And it was en route from New York to Cuba to pick up another cargo. So it was sailing in ballast, which I'll talk about more in a second. It was 400 feet long, so it was pretty large, but not crazy big for the standards of the day, but still a 400-foot long tanker. And it did have an armed guard crew on it. So very initially, in January, February of 42, there was really no organization of any kind. Ships were just kind of going up and down the coast, still had all their lights on. The coast wasn't blacked out. They were basically sitting ducks. By this time, they had instituted some convoy systems, escort vessels, bucket brigades they were called, where you'd have one or more ships would assemble and they would have an armed escort that would have some anti-submarine capabilities. But then it would also, in some instances on these merchant vessels, place armed guard crews. So this vessel, even though it was exclusively a merchant vessel in its operating life, it did have an armed guard crew on it with 2 3-inch guns and 2 30 caliber machine guns, which the 3-inch guns they pack a pretty heavy punch. The 30 cals, I don't know what you really could be expected to do against a submarine with a couple 30 caliber machine guns. But anyhow, that's how it was outfitted. When on April 29th, it was coming down towards Cape Lookout, and it was struck with one torpedo by the U-402, and it began to sink. So the good thing is there were no casualties at this point, and it was in shallow water. So you'll see here these photographs. These are photographs of the vessel after it was torpedoed. Here on the bow, you can see one of the 3-inch deck guns on this mount here that was added on, and you'll see that obviously the forward portion of the vessel is sticking up out of the water. The stern of the ship is actually sitting on the bottom, right? So the vessel itself is only in about 55, 60 feet of water, and the vessel is much bigger than that. So it could actually sit on the bottom and was basically still in pretty decent shape. So they said, okay, we'll get it did have one escort vessel. They offloaded the crew, took them into Morehead City, and then they called in a salvage tug called the Relief, which was meant to come out and recover what it could of the Ashkhabad. So I did mention a moment ago that the Ashkhabad was sailing in ballast, which means it had no cargo. And in ballast, it just means that these ships were, when they weren't going through the ocean, they were oftentimes coming through other waterways that the depth was significant. So if they're going through canals or locks, they would have, or if they just didn't have a cargo at all, they would flood a portion of the hull for stability purposes or to adjust how deep they sat in the water. So when it didn't have cargo in it, they needed to have the vessel partially flooded, so it had a double bottom, so it could pump water into a cell in between, a layer in between the hull that would allow it to have those buoyancy characteristics. So when it was going and not full of cargo, it would still be seaworthy. The upshot of this is that if you were sailing in ballast, you were less likely to sink if you were hit with a torpedo, because it created almost like a little buffer between you and the damage, and you wouldn't be so heavy with cargo that you would sink immediately. So this was, the fact that it was sailing in ballast and it was in shallow water meant that it was a very good candidate for recovery, and it wasn't going to move anywhere because it was sort of anchored to the bottom. Unfortunately, there was a US vessel called the Sems, because so many ships were being sunk during this period. They sort of had a standing order that said, sink any derelict ship that you come across if it's a hazard to navigation. So the Sems came along. Actually, before that, there was an armed anti-submarine vessel called the HMT Hertfordshire, a British crew that was on loan to us, that came across this about a day or so after it was that the Ashkhabad crew got off board, and they thought it was abandoned, so they started ransacking it. They started stealing everything off of it they possibly could, and the next day the Sems came by and said, oh, there's a derelict vessel, didn't realize it was scheduled to be recovered, and basically just started shelling it, blew it up, right? Blew it away. So it had an unfortunate demise, started to be sunk by the U-boat, and then was finished off sort of unintentionally by friendly forces as they feared that it was a navigation hazard. So that brings us up to now. Now, interestingly, I should note that the vessel that sunk the Ashkhabad, the U-boat that sunk the Ashkhabad, was called the U402, captained by a guy named von Forstner. He went on to sink another ship off the coast of North Carolina called the USS Cythera. And the Cythera was a converted, very, very, very nice yacht that was given on loan to the Navy. They were basically taking any ship that they could at the time and slapping on a couple of depth charge racks and some deck guns and saying, you're now a United States ship, go fight U-boats. And so the U402 came across the Cythera off a little further offshore, but off of the Cape Lookout area, and it sunk the Cythera. Most of the crew of the Cythera was killed during this action, except for 2 of the crew were actually picked up by the 402, taken on board the U-boat, and brought back to Germany as POWs. That's the only instance of that having happened off the East Coast, where U.S. sailors, just within a few miles of the United States, were picked up by enemy forces and taken back and put in prison camps. That was pretty interesting little side note. So this brings us to our survey. So I'll talk a little bit about the methods, the challenges, kind of how we do the work that we do in the water, and some of the results that we got from doing this research. Now, as I mentioned, we're a federal program, and we also have in our little sites trying to do this survey of 50 or more wrecks. So we're in a position where we really want to involve the community as much as we possibly can in the work that we're doing. I have a couple of people that I work with at my site, but it's just a few of us. We partner with Coastal Studies Institute, we partner with ECU, we partner with other federal agencies, the Park Service, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, all sorts of folks. We kind of beg, borrow, and steal where we can to get the job done that we need. And one critical component of this is working with skilled members of the community and the dive community that can come out and participate on these surveys with us. So we have, through a program called the Nautical Archaeology Society, this is a program that's based out of the UK. It's a series of curriculum, really, that's designed to train recreational divers how to do the recording and approach these resources the way that archaeologists do, so the archaeologists can say, hey, let's all work together on this and generate some products that are going to be meaningful for both parties. So we have a program and we partner again with CSI on implementing some of these things, where we bring these folks together and we run through these. There's four parts to it. We usually run through the first 2 parts and some elements of the third. But we spin these guys up. We go through a series of lectures so they understand how we approach these resources, and then we do a lot of hands-on training. How do you record the shipwreck? What are we looking for? Let's go out to the quarry, put these guys in dive gear, and map out a test wreck, and learn how to take the measurements out of the water and extrapolate those out onto a master plan. And then once they kind of master those skills, we actually set up these projects and have them come and participate and work with us. So that's the way that we approach this, is to have a number of volunteers through. In the instance of this particular survey, it was with a group called the Battle of the Atlantic Research and Expedition Group. That's just a group of recreational divers that are interested in the history of World War I, World War II. So this is just an example of the pre-mission training. We go to these confined water sites and local rock quarries and stretch a baseline over the wreck and show them all the different techniques that they need to do to record it up to the standards that are useful for scientific evaluation of the site. The other thing that we did on this site is, in addition to the hands-on recording, is photo and video documentation and decompression diving. Even though the site is only in 60 feet of water, we still use decompression diving for many of the divers because they could stay a lot longer. For those of you guys that aren't divers, your time is limited the deeper that you go. So the more that you can stretch that out, the better it is, because ultimately this is what we're trying to produce. So you'll see here on the right, this is sort of the master plan. Divers take these hard slates in the water with them, and they record every little feature, every little beam, every little chunk of wreck that they can find, and they reference it back to a master baseline, and then you plot in and scale out all these different features. If you remember, I said the Ashkhabad's 400 feet long, and it has been dynamited, it has been wire dragged as a navigation hazard, it was torpedoed, it was shot by the USS Sems. This thing is the definition of a wreck. I mean, it is just a mess. So you can imagine that recording this disarticulated debris field, essentially, is quite time consuming. So the more time that you can have on the bottom, the better. So with conventional scuba, you would get maybe 40 minutes or so at that depth per person. And with decompression diving, we were getting an hour and a half or more. So it was basically doubling our time on the bottom that we could actually get work done per person. So the other methods that we used for this survey was, we kind of, as I said, it was a very, very big wreck and very disarticulated. So we set ourselves up for success by conducting a pre-survey acoustic survey. And this is pretty cool. We're fortunate enough to be able to get our hands on some pretty neat technology from time to time. I'll talk a little bit more about this in a second, but this is basically an image of the site using sonar. The traditional method, we would build upon that using the baseline and offsets, but reference it back to some of these other features that we could see in the acoustic survey. And then, of course, collect an enormous photo record of the sites, both for a visual record, but also we could scale photographs and get finer detail later on when we're finishing up the site plan. And I mentioned the decompression diving as well. So just a little bit on the acoustic survey. For those of you, is anyone familiar with sonar in any capacity? The sonar just stands for sound navigation and ranging. So all it is you're sending out a sound wave, and you're measuring the time it takes a sound wave to travel and hit an object and then come back to it, right? So that's all it is. And that's, in its simplest form, that's what it is. This is called a multi-beam system, or multi-beam sonar. So it's sending out millions of these things, right? So a lot of these individual pings are being measured in 3D space where they hit this object. So they come back together, you put them in a computer program, and it creates a cloud of those points, right? And the more clustered together, you start to see individual features. It's called a point cloud. And it actually creates sort of an image using sound, right? So you can visualize what's there without having to get in the water. So this is usually hull mounted. This particular one that we just With this particular one we did based from an AUV, which is an autonomous underwater vehicle, basically a pre-programmed little robot that swims a pattern and sends out this signal. We recover it, download it, and look at it. So you'll see the difference here between these are the same wreck, but two different types of sonar, or same type but different frequencies. So this is a lower frequency system, so you'll see that the resolution of this is quite low. You're not really seeing much here, but we would do something like this to figure out what the overall extent is of the wreck, because it's lower frequency, it's covering a wider area, you can do it a lot quicker. And then once we know exactly where it is, we kind of tighten up, jack up the frequency, and get a better, prettier image of the site. And I'll show you some better images of this here. The cool thing about this is it gives you a huge head start in recording a site like this. Once you understand how to look at the sonar imagery, you can see here these sort of horizontal features. Those are all actually just the frames of the inside of the hull. Right? So the hull's flayed out and you're seeing the actual supporting frames inside there. This feature here, you can see these sort of scalloped looking things. That is this spare propeller that's sitting in the sand. So if you see these features here, you can see the propeller there, and that's a photograph of the propeller. Down here, you can see these two green little nubs that are sticking out here. That is these bits here that you see that would have been the tie-in points for the ropes on the vessel. So you look at this and you can start to see some of these features, and but ultimately you're still trying to figure out what it exactly is that you're looking at. So the benefit of having the divers go in and you basically have this good starting point, and then you go and you're going to refine it, right? So the divers are going to get down and they're going to sit down and they're going to look at a little object, and they're going to spend half their dive figuring out what it is, for one, because it's covered in marine growth and concretion, and then they're going to sketch it and record it and reference it back to these master plans. And ultimately, you're going to be creating this. So this is what we consider the final archaeological site plan. This is a scale drawing that was created by divers, informed by the sonar, but this has a lot more detail. So you probably can't see on this scale here, but up here at the bow, you're seeing a pile of chain. The anchor is one of the anchors is up here at the bow. Again, here's those towing bits, or not towing bits, but just tie-in bits there. The spare propeller here. You can see here there's 3 boilers that are amidships, one of which is rolled off of its saddle and laying out, probably from having been wire dragged. Just aft of it is all the engineering space, and again, you can't see it quite at this scale, but this is one of the condensers. You can see each individual little copper condensing rod that's inside of that. The cylinder heads for the engine are back here. The casing has been blown out, but you can still see all the cylinder heads and the pistons for the expansion steam engine that was on site. So you can see this gives you a lot more interpretive detail, because you're forced to go down there and look at each one of those individual objects. But again, we use this sonar so we can figure out where some of these large scale features are, so we don't have to figure out exactly where the boilers are in space. I know this is all geo-rectified. That's the other benefit of this. So not only does each one of those points exist in 3D space, but it also exists in a mapping system, right? So if there's a coordinate, a geospatial coordinate, like a GPS coordinate for each one of those little teeny tiny points that make up this whole image. So you can drop that into mapping software and you know exactly where on earth this thing is. So I don't need to spend all that much time figuring out where these boilers are. I can be pretty confident that the placement of these large features is accurate, right? And some of these other things, like I know for sure that this big section of the hull is there, these major features, but really beyond that, you can't tell what's there. I can tell it's a shipwreck, I can tell those are boilers, I can tell this is some framing and things like this. But back here, that's not really meaningful other than general distribution. It doesn't tell you anything about what that is. You can't tell that that's part of the steam engine. You can't tell that there's condensing rods in there. And that's where that other level of detail comes in. So we combine the two, and that's really where you get to a more complete understanding of the site. And this is just a cleaned up, different visualization of the same data. And again, you're just seeing the same things here. There's that propeller, there's these boilers, and you can see the overall distribution of the site. But again, this isn't really telling you anything. Back here, this feature is actually the steering quadrant, so it's part of the steering mechanism at the stern. So it's a large quadrant that would have given the helm some mechanical advantage to steer the ship. You can't tell what that is at this level, even though this is about as good as you can get on multibeam. This is really high-end multibeam imagery. It gets a little bit better, but not by much. But when you combine the two, so this is an overlay of both the multibeam imagery and the actual diver recorded survey, then you're really getting at really solid, scientifically rooted positioning, but also there's an interpretive element from the archaeologists and the divers who've been down there and have looked at all these features and have been able to incorporate them. So altogether, these things give you a much more comprehensive understanding of what remains are still at the site. So that's really what we try to do, is try to have that that complete record. And this does a couple of things. One, it becomes the permanent record of the site at that time. It's a snapshot of what it was looking like in 2013. So if we're putting ourselves in a position to manage these resources, we can go back in 5 years and 10 years and we can say, all right, what's happening at the site? What did it look like then? And what does it look like now? Has there been impacts from storms? Has there been impacts from climate change? Has there been impacts from divers on the site removing artifacts? Has there been, and we really can't say any of those things until we have that baseline understanding of what's on the site. In addition to that, we also use these things for outreach and interpretive reasons, right? So what we really hope is that people will understand that these resources are out there and that they're unique in our country, to interact with them better. So we take these site plans. This is the same type of final product, but this is the wreck of the HMT Bedfordshire. This is a British trawler that was sunk. You may be familiar, there's a couple of sailors washed up on the shore. A few of them are buried at the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse, and then there's a British cemetery on Ocracoke Island. They're from this wreck that's off of Cape Lookout. So we take these site plans that are used, and we use them for interpretation as archaeologists. We use them to nominate these sites to the National Register, but then we also use them for these outreach products. So we go through and, you know, you're only, as a diver, seeing maybe, if you're lucky, 30, 40 feet, maybe a little more, sometimes much less of a snapshot at any given time because of the visibility. So if you're only visiting a site once or twice and it's broken up and scattered around like this, it can be difficult to understand what it is that you're even looking at. So we develop these dive cards to pass out to divers that identify all these different features on the wrecks, so that if they're diving on them, it will hopefully enhance their experience of interacting with them, know what they're looking at. So that's basically the quick and dirty, or maybe not so quick, version of how we interact with these sites and what we're trying to do. The real reason that we're interested in doing this, at least from my perspective, is that we have, as I mentioned before, very little tangible connection in this country as far as sites related to World War II. And I think that it's amazing, the more you look at the resources that are out here, how much there really is, and how much North Carolina in particular is sort of special among what is out there. And if you look at sites like Little Bighorn or Gettysburg or Yorktown Battlefield up in Yorktown, Virginia, where there are places in this country that we have had important things happen, we recognize them, we memorialize them in some way. We say this is something special happened here that changed the events of the world, and I would argue that nothing has been more influential in the modern world that we live in than World War II. And we have this incredible World War II battlefield out here that is only minimally known to the public. So that's one of our big goals, is getting people to understand there's a pretty important collection of resources out here that really deserves a lot more attention than it has gotten. So with that, I will field questions.
Thank you, Joe.